I've lived most of my days by habit. Not by choice, not because I ever thought routine was some kind of salvation, but because waking before the first light, pulling on my boots slow, and listening for the wind through the cracks in the cabin walls was the only way I knew to keep going. Habit keeps a man alive when the years and the ghosts try to take the rest. I learned that in the war, and I learned it again when fever took my wife and the child she carried. Since then, every morning has started with the same weight in my thigh, shrapnel that no surgeon ever dug out. Pain wakes me, and I take it as proof the leg still works. I tell myself that's a fair bargain, even when it burns like iron in the bone. The stove is always my first stop. I fill the kettle, set it down on the iron plate, and wait for the click of water as it pushes toward a boil. There's comfort in that sound, like a heartbeat I can depend on when my own chest feels too heavy. Coffee follows, black, bitter, a taste that twists my jaw until it feels alive again. I step out to the porch with that tin mug, the world quiet except for dust shifting low over the dead sorghum rows. Nothing moves most mornings, no cattle, just 2 goats I keep more out of pity than use. The land is wide and empty, and most days I am too. That quiet, I thought it was safety once. I told myself no one could leave me if no one stayed. But quiet has a way of turning cruel. It lets the memories slip in, the midwife's whisper, the way silence followed, the grave I dug too soon. That's why I work without stopping, fix the fence, split the kindling, ride the creek for strays even when there are none. Work keeps a man from drowning in thoughts. But there are moments even work cannot shield you from. I remember the sound clear as gunfire, though it was softer than a knock. Tap. Pause. Tap again. My hand went to my revolver before my mind caught up. Habit. The kind that kept me alive when bullets cut the air back east. I opened the door, expecting maybe a shutter loose or a neighbor foolish enough to come calling. But it wasn't that. It was a baby. She lay on the rough boards wrapped in buckskin torn from a woman's dress, beadwork still clinging to one side. No note, no basket, just wide glassy eyes and tiny fists that fluttered once, then went still. For a long moment I didn't breathe. Memory stabbed, sharp. My wife's labor, the silence afterward, the hollow weight of holding nothing, yet here was something, someone. Breathing shallow, skin cool but alive. I lifted her slow, careful of her head, and the warmth of her tiny body bled right through my shirt. She whimpered, then locked her eyes on my collar button like it was the only solid thing she could trust. I had a choice in that instant. Ride to town, hand her off to the sheriff, watch as townsfolk gawked and whispered, maybe see her carted 50 miles east to some orphanage where she'd ride alone in a wagon. Or I could shut the door and figure it out myself. I'd never been a praying man, not really, but I felt something like a prayer stir in my chest. My jaw set. I carried her inside. I lined a box with an old wool blanket, found a scrap of molasses and mixed it with warm water, dribbled drops into her mouth with a strip of cotton. She swallowed, eyes drifting closed, and in that quiet moment, with my hands shaking harder than they had in any skirmish since '64, I realized I didn't regret it. Not one bit. 5 days passed with her close against my chest in a sling I'd cut from an old flour sack. I talked to her, awkward at first, muttering about every nail I hammered or board I straightened, but silence felt worse, so I kept at it. She stared at my mouth like she was memorizing the shape of words. I caught myself looking down the road each dusk, lantern lit on the porch rail, as if signaling to someone I couldn't name. I didn't know then that I was waiting, and waiting is what saved me. Because on the 5th night, rain came hard and sudden, and with it, she came too, the woman who had left that child at my door. She was barely standing, hair plastered, fever burning her skin, an Apache woman, barefoot, clothing soaked, arms trembling from exhaustion. She didn't look at me. Her eyes went straight to the box near the stove where the baby stirred. I opened the door wide before she could fall. She crossed the room, knelt beside the box, and when the baby cried, she pressed her forehead to those tiny ribs and whispered words I couldn't understand, but I understood the sound, relief so raw it near broke her. I laid a blanket over her shoulders. She flinched, then looked up at me, cautious, defiant, but didn't move away. "You've got a fever," I said. "Sit by the fire." She obeyed, not from trust, but because her strength was spent. That was the night everything shifted. My cabin wasn't silent anymore. Purpose filled the air again, heavy as smoke. I didn't know if the law would call it harboring, or if the town would call it foolish. But I knew what my gut told me. Keep them safe. Keep them fed. Ask nothing they weren't ready to share. For the first time in 6 years, I didn't dread the morning. And that's where my story begins. A man who thought his life was finished, who thought quiet was all he had left, opened a door and found a baby. Then days later, found her mother too. Everything that came after, the danger, the fear, the love I didn't expect, it started there on that porch with a sound so soft, most men might have missed it. But I didn't. If you've stayed with me this far, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. And follow the channel if you want to hear the rest, because this story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever thought they'd lost everything, only to find life waiting on the other side of a knock. I never thought I'd see the day when the sound of a soft tap would shake me more than cannon fire ever had, but that morning it did. I was sitting on the porch with my coffee, bitter enough to curl my tongue, staring out at the same patch of dead sorghum I'd been staring at for years. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes a man believe nothing can surprise him anymore. Then it came. Tap. Faint as a pebble against wood. My hand went to my revolver before my mind had even caught up. Habit, drilled into me from years of war, kept me alive when reason lagged behind. I waited, ears sharp, heart working harder than I cared to admit. Another tap followed, deliberate, patient, not the wild rattle of loose boards. I set my mug down and stood slow, every part of my body telling me I was about to face something, though I couldn't say what. The sound was too soft to belong to any rider or neighbor, too intentional to be a trick of the wind. My thumb rested on the hammer as I opened the door, ready for whatever fool thing waited out there. But I wasn't ready. No man could be. It was a baby. She lay wrapped in buckskin on the porch boards, beadwork glinting on one torn edge, like something ripped in a hurry. No basket, no note, no explanation. Just wide, glassy eyes staring back at me as though I'd been expected all along. Her fists fluttered once, a weak little attempt, then went still again, like the effort had cost her. I'd seen men shot through the lung breathe steadier than she did in that moment. For a long while, I couldn't move. My body felt locked between memory and the present. I heard my wife's last cry, remembered the silence that followed the midwife's whisper. I had dug 2 graves that winter, one far too small. Now, here lay another child at my door. I crouched down, revolver still loose in my hand, though I'd forgotten about it the moment I saw her face. Her skin was cool, too cool. She was alive but fragile, breaths shallow and uneven. Whoever left her had vanished into the dust without looking back. My chest tightened and my throat felt dry as tinder. I reached out, careful as I'd never been before in my life, and lifted her. She was lighter than a bundle of kindling, small head fitting in the palm of my hand, eyes fixed on the button of my coat as if it was the only steady thing in her world. The warmth of her body bled into my shirt, thin though it was, and with that warmth came something I hadn't let myself feel in 6 years: responsibility. The decision waited like a rifle at my back. Ride into town, hand her off to Sheriff Mallory, listen to the townsfolk chatter about the fool who found an abandoned baby, hear someone suggest sending her 50 miles east to the orphanage where children vanish into silence, or shut the door and figure it out myself. I could already picture her rattling alone in the back of a wagon, cold wind in her face, strangers deciding her worth like she was a scrap of property. My jaw set hard at the thought I'd buried enough of my own. I wasn't about to hand her over to be forgotten. I carried her inside. The stove heat had filled the cabin, a small mercy against the drafty walls. I lined a box with an old wool blanket, set her down gentle, and searched the shelves for anything she could take. No cow, no fresh milk, just half a bottle of molasses. I mixed a thin ribbon of it with warm water, tested it on my wrist like I once saw my wife do, and dribbled drops into her tiny mouth with a scrap of clean cotton. She swallowed, slow at first, then steadier. Her eyelids fluttered, and at last they fell closed. She slept. I sat on the stool, hands planted on my knees, and felt my heart pounding harder than it ever had in battle. I waited for regret, for the voice that always came when I tried to imagine a different life, but none came, only the heavy truth that someone had chosen this porch for a reason. Maybe they thought I'd know what to do. Maybe they thought I'd do nothing. Either way, the choice was mine now, and I'd already made it. That first night, I kept her near the stove in that box, rising every few hours to check her breathing. Each soft whimper pulled me from sleep faster than any bugle ever had. I fed her the makeshift syrup, humming nonsense under my breath, because silence felt too heavy for her small chest to carry alone. She survived the night, and by morning so did I. By the second day, I had fashioned a sling out of an old flour sack, tying it across my shoulder to keep her close as I worked. I fixed the south fence with her nestled against my chest, hammer striking nails steady while I muttered about every board and every post. She watched me, dark eyes wide, as though memorizing my mouth's movements, storing up words she'd need later. I found myself speaking more than I had in years, not because I expected her to answer, but because the cabin didn't feel so hollow when my voice filled it. At dusk, I set the lantern on the porch rail, a habit I couldn't explain even to myself. Maybe it was a signal, though I didn't know for whom. Each evening I found my eyes drifting east down the road, waiting for a shadow, a figure, some sign of whoever had left her. None came, yet I kept lighting that lantern like a man afraid to admit hope. By the fifth day, she had become something more than a burden I'd taken on. She had become Little One, a name that slipped from my lips before I even realized it. She had changed the rhythm of my days. Work no longer kept me from drowning. It simply made room for her to be carried along in the current with me. I didn't know then that she was only the beginning, that the knock on my door would come again, harder this time, with a woman half dead from fever. All I knew was that for the first time in 6 long winters, I didn't dread waking in the morning. Those 5 days felt longer than whole winters I'd lived through, and yet they passed in a blur that left me changed in ways I couldn't name. The first night, I hardly slept. Every time the baby stirred, I jolted awake, afraid her breathing had stopped. I'd sit up on the stool, the rifle leaning against my knee like an old companion, but my eyes kept drifting to the wooden box by the stove where she lay curled. Each faint sigh that slipped from her chest carried me through the dark hours. When dawn crept in, I realized I had survived the night not because of habit, but because of her. By the second day, the cabin had already begun to feel different. The place had always held silence like a weight pressing against my ribs, but now that silence was interrupted by her small sounds, a whimper here, a hiccup, a sudden sharp cry that sent me rushing before I'd even finished tying my boot. My whole body seemed tuned to her, as if her voice had replaced the bugle call of my soldiering days. I warmed molasses water on the stove, tested it against my wrist, and dribbled it gently into her mouth. She swallowed greedily, and when her eyes fluttered shut, a strange warmth spread through me, something that felt like triumph. I muttered to myself, "We're making do, little one. We're getting by." On the third day, I rigged the flour sack into a sling and carried her against my chest while I worked outside. The south fence had been sagging all winter, and the wind threatened to take it down for good. With her nestled close, I hammered boards into place, each strike steady, my voice low as I spoke to her about what I was doing. "This here keeps the goats from wandering," I explained, though she was far too young to understand. Still, her eyes followed my mouth as though she was studying the shape of every word. It felt good to be heard again, even if it was only by someone who couldn't answer back. That night, I found myself talking longer than I meant to. I told her about the goats, about how the creek ran dry last summer, about how the sorghum had failed 3 years in a row. I even told her about my wife, though I hadn't spoken that name in years. My voice caught, but I kept going, because silence seemed heavier than grief. When she yawned and blinked up at me with those dark, steady eyes, it felt like she was giving me permission to keep breathing. By the 4th day, she had grown stronger. Her head lifted for a moment before falling back against the sling. Her hands, so small they hardly seemed real, reached for my shirt buttons. I laughed once, a short, awkward sound that startled me. I hadn't heard that noise come from my own mouth since before the fever took my wife. It felt strange, like discovering an old tool rusted and forgotten, then finding it still worked. I muttered, "Don't expect much more of that," but the truth was, it felt good. Every dusk, I lit the lantern and set it on the porch rail. I told myself it was just habit, but deep down, I knew it was a signal. To who, I couldn't say. Maybe to whoever had left her, maybe to myself. Some nights, I found my eyes drifting east down the wagon ruts until the horizon blurred. I thought about the kind of woman who would leave her child at my door. I wondered if she was alive, if she was searching the dark for the glow of a lantern. The thought unsettled me, but I kept lighting it. A man doesn't invite fate, but sometimes he leaves the door cracked, just in case. On the 5th day, I felt a shift. I caught myself calling her "little one" without thinking, the words rolling off my tongue like they'd belonged to me all along. She wasn't just a burden I had picked up out of stubbornness anymore. She was becoming part of the rhythm of my days. I split kindling with her, strapped to me, the steady rise and fall of the axe rocking her to sleep. I sat on the porch rail with her in my arms, staring at the road and muttering about clouds building in the west. She watched me with that quiet patience only babies have, as though I was the one being studied. That night, when I laid her in the box lined with blankets, I sat close by, listening to the rain beginning to spit against the roof. The sound was soft at first, then steady. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and said quietly, "I don't know who you are or why you ended up here, but I reckon we'll figure it out together." My own voice startled me because it was gentler than I remembered it being. I hadn't spoken to anyone like that since before the war, before the graves. I waited for regret to creep in, the way it always did after I let my guard down. But regret never came. Instead, there was a weight in my chest that felt different from grief. Heavy, yes, but alive, like the thrum of a heartbeat after a long march. I realized then that I wasn't just keeping her alive, she was keeping me alive too. On the morning of the 6th day, when the storm clouds finally broke and the rain came down hard, I didn't know yet that her mother would appear at my door. I didn't know the fevered woman staggering across the yard would change everything again, but I knew something had shifted. The cabin wasn't just mine anymore. It had been quiet too long, and now it was filled with a presence that didn't let me slip back into the hollow places. For the first time in years, I didn't dread the coming day. I looked at the box by the stove where she stirred, tiny fists curling, and I felt something I had thought was buried with my wife. Hope. Fragile and unsteady, but real. The night she came back is burned into me like a scar I'll never be rid of. I had just set the baby in her box by the stove, the rain outside coming harder than any I'd heard all season. Wind rattled the shutters, and every crack in the cabin whistled with the storm. I'd been staring into the fire, telling myself the lantern on the porch would keep its vigil, same as the 4 nights before. I didn't expect anyone to see it, much less answer it. But then, through the curtain of rain, I caught sight of movement. Figure, small, stumbling hair plastered across her face. I was at the door before she could knock. She never did. She leaned against the post, barefoot, soaked through, her arms hanging limp at her sides. Her skin burned with fever, patches of red beneath streaks of mud, and her fingers shook like she couldn't hold on to anything if she tried. She didn't look at me. Her eyes went straight past, to the box by the stove where the baby stirred. In that moment, I understood who she was, the one who had left the child and the one who had come back for her. I opened the door wide and stepped aside. She crossed the threshold without a word, her knees nearly giving out. She fell to the box and pressed both palms to its rough edge. The baby woke, let out a thin cry, and the woman's shoulders shook so hard I thought she'd break apart. She pulled the child close, pressed her forehead to the baby's ribs, whispering words I couldn't understand. But I didn't need the language to know the sound. Relief, raw and desperate, like she'd been holding her breath for 5 days and could finally let it out. I shut the door against the storm, slid the bar into place, and for the first time in years, it wasn't to keep something out. It was to keep someone in, where the fire was warm and the walls might hold. I pulled a blanket from the shelf and laid it over her shoulders. She flinched at the touch, head snapping up, eyes wide, cautious, defiant, but she didn't pull away. "You've got a fever," I said, my voice low. "Sit by the fire." She obeyed, not because she trusted me, but because she had nothing left to give. I poured hot water over willow bark, the only medicine I had left in the larder, and held the cup to her lips. She drank, slow, every swallow an effort. The baby settled against her chest, tiny hands curled into the buckskin shawl that had been torn in haste. For the first time since she'd come into my life, the child looked content, like the world had righted itself. I noticed then the marks on the woman's skin, small burns on her wrists, scars across one shoulder, new enough to still look angry. They told a story she hadn't spoken, and I didn't ask. I remembered all too well how interrogation feels when grief is raw, when survival is the only thing holding you upright. Instead, I said the only thing that mattered. "She's been eating, not much, molasses water. Kept her alive." Her eyes filled at that, not with tears, but something heavier, like gratitude she couldn't carry alone. Her voice came rough, just one word, "Nidita." "Burke," I answered. Nothing else needed saying. I stoked the fire, rolled out another pallet near the stove, and set the kettle to steam again. Nidita lay down, the baby tucked inside her shawl. I sat in the chair with my rifle across my lap, habit I couldn't shake, but this time it wasn't mistrust that kept it close. It was the knowledge that a woman and a child slept under my roof, and I meant to keep them safe. All through the night, the storm battered the cabin, and I stayed half awake, half listening. Her fever sweat soaked the blanket, and more than once I wiped her brow with a damp cloth. The motion came back to me too easy, the same way I had once cooled my wife's skin when the fever had taken her. My throat ached remembering it, but I didn't stop. When dawn bled pale through the cracks in the wall, Nidita finally slept sound, the baby cradled against her chest, both of them breathing slow and steady. I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders for the first time in years. I didn't know what the law would call what I'd done, harboring, aiding, whatever words men in town might use. I didn't care. The mission was clear: keep them safe, keep them fed, ask nothing they weren't ready to share. When the fire burned low, I stepped outside to split kindling. The rain had passed, leaving the ground soaked and the air sharp with the scent of cedar and wet earth. That was when I heard the baby cry. Not the weak whimper of before, but a full-bodied wail that cut through the morning stillness. I dropped the hatchet and limped back fast, heart thudding. Through the open door, I saw her, Nidita swaying in a crouch, holding the child close. Her hair hung tangled and damp, but the fever had broken some. Her eyes were sharper, clearer, and she moved with the quiet steadiness of a mother who remembered who she was. Her voice was low, words in her own tongue, spoken not for me, but for the baby, alone. I paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame, instinct telling me to help, but something deeper, urging me to stand still. She didn't need me in that moment. She was remembering herself, and the baby needed that more than she needed me. So I eased the door shut and let her have the space. That morning, I cooked cornmeal mush with goat's milk, stretching what little we had. When I handed her the tin plate, she didn't ask questions. She sat cross-legged on the floor, blanket still around her shoulders, and ate while the baby suckled. Later, she swept the corner by the stove, gathered the sweat-soaked blanket, and hung it to dry. She washed the spoon she'd used and set it back on the shelf like she meant to be there tomorrow, too. The questions pressed at me, where she came from, who had hurt her, why she left the child at my door, but I kept them in. I asked only one while we shelled beans on the porch. "How long since you ate?" She squinted into the sun before answering. 3 days. "You come far?" She nodded once. "Walked from Dry Gulch, East Ridge. That was 15 miles, if not more. Barefoot, fevered, carrying the weight of fear and guilt and a mother's worry. It humbled me." She rubbed her cracked hands with the salve I set beside her without a word of thanks, but that was what I liked. She didn't grovel. She did what needed doing, and just like that, without promise or plan, she stayed. The days that followed settled into something I didn't expect. Quiet, but not the hollow kind I'd grown used to. It was a different quiet, the kind that hums with presence, where each small sound seems to carry meaning. I'd wake before first light like always, listening to the ache in my leg and the wind brushing against the cabin walls. But now, when I swung my feet to the floor, there were other sounds. The soft crackle of the fire Nadita had stirred before I even rose, the small rustle of the baby shifting in her shawl, a low hum, words in a tongue not mine, spoken gently into the stillness. For 6 years, I'd lived in a house that echoed only with my breath, and suddenly, it wasn't empty anymore. Nadita never asked if she could stay. She didn't need to. She was simply there each morning, moving through the space like she had known it before me. She fed the fire, boiled goat milk for the baby, and laid her blanket neatly to dry across the porch rail. I never told her to, never asked, but I found myself expecting it, even relying on it. I slept in the chair by the door most nights, rifle leaning against my leg, while she and the baby took the cot. The baby slept wherever she happened to land, sometimes in the box by the stove, sometimes bundled against her mother, once even in my old hat when Nadita needed to set her down. That made me laugh, quiet and short, but real. The sound startling enough to my own ears that I had to look away. She heard it too, her eyes flicking toward me, but she didn't say a word. She just let it be. We didn't talk much in those first days. Our words were spare, cautious, measured. I had questions pressing inside me like nails against a board. Who had left those scars on her arms? Who did she fear was coming back for her? Why had she trusted my door of all places? But I bit them back. Questions are heavy things. They make people run when they're not ready to stand. I knew that from the war, and from grief, and from the memory of strangers' pity after I buried my wife. So instead, I asked the smaller things, the ones she could carry. One afternoon, while we shelled beans on the porch, I asked, "How long since you ate?" Her hands stilled for a moment before she answered, 3 days. "You come far?" She nodded. "Dry Gulch, East Ridge." 15 miles at least, barefoot, fevered, carrying her child and her fear. That answered more than any story could have. I watched her hands, calloused and cracked, blisters broken raw, and I fetched the tin of salve I used for the goats. I set it beside her without a word. She rubbed it into her palms like it was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't thank me, and I didn't expect her to. I liked that about her. She didn't treat me like a savior, only like another soul trying to make it through the day. Slowly, the rhythm of our days began to braid together. She swept the corners of the cabin, patched my shirts, strung a line for laundry across the yard. She cooked when she had the strength, boiling cornmeal mush and stretching it with goat milk, always careful to save enough for the baby. I found myself offering more than I used to. I'd sharpen her kitchen knife without being asked, leave tools within reach on her side of the porch, split extra wood so she wouldn't have to struggle with it. None of it was spoken. We didn't need to. In the evenings, we sat by the fire, the baby asleep in her box or curled against Nadita's chest. I'd polish old tools, running cloth over iron that hadn't been touched in years, while she mended torn sleeves with stitches so neat they looked like they'd always belonged. Sometimes she hummed, a low tune that made the baby stir, then settle again. I didn't recognize the song, but it steadied me. The silence between us wasn't a wall anymore. It was a space we shared, wide enough for both our ghosts. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way she carried herself, wary but not weak. The scars along her wrist, how they caught the light of the fire. The way her eyes darted to the door at sudden sounds, not out of suspicion, but out of memory. She'd lived through something, that much was clear, and it had taught her to never let her guard down. But when she looked at the baby, her shoulders eased. There was no fear in her then, only love, steady and unshaken. I realized I had stopped thinking of them as visitors. They weren't just staying a night or two until strength returned. They had become part of the place. The cabin felt lived in again, not just occupied. The stove gave more heat. The walls seemed less thin, the nights less empty. And me, I was different too. I found myself listening for footsteps on the porch, not with dread, but with a strange kind of relief. When I caught the scent of smoke and stew before I reached the door, I didn't feel the old hollowness anymore. I didn't know what name the world would give to what we had. Strangers, maybe. Or trespassers. Some would call it foolish. Others might call it wrong. But I didn't care. I only knew what I felt when I looked at that baby breathing steady in her box, or when I caught Nadita's eyes watching me while I worked. I wasn't alone anymore, and they weren't either. There was no promise between us, no declaration, just presence. And in that presence, I found something steadier than any vow I'd ever spoken. The war had taught me to measure survival in days, but this was different. This felt like living. It was near the end of the week when the silence between us finally gave way to something heavier. I'd been out at the fence line most of the afternoon, mending a post that had leaned too long against the wind. The baby was slung against my chest in that flour sack carrier, her head tucked under my chin, her breath warm and steady like a reminder of why my hands kept moving. I'd driven the last nail when I felt it, that prickling sense you get when someone's eyes are on you. I turned, and there she was, standing a few yards back, her arms folded tight across her chest, watching me. Not suspicious, not afraid, just measuring, like she was trying to decide what kind of man I really was. I straightened slow, my bad leg stiff, and leaned the hammer against the post. She didn't look away. For a long moment, we just stood there, the wind shifting dust between us, the baby stirring but not crying. Finally she spoke, her voice low and even, the first real question she'd asked me since she came back. "Why'd you keep her?" The words hit deeper than I expected. I looked down at the fence rail, running my hand over the grain of the wood like it might hold the answer. Truth is, I hadn't thought too long when I found that child on my porch. My body just moved before my mind could catch up. Still, I wanted to answer her straight. "Didn't feel right leaving her out there," I said at last. "Not in the cold. Not alone." Her jaw tightened, and I could see she wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her eyes on the baby more than on me. "I left her because I thought she'd have a better chance," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but it carried the weight of someone forcing truth out one word at a time. "Not because I didn't want her, because I thought he'd come back. Said he'd kill her if I didn't go." My chest went cold, the kind of cold that comes when a man's rage is too deep to burn hot. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't need a name. I'd known the type before. Men who thought women were theirs to claim, children theirs to threaten, lives theirs to crush. I'd seen them in the war, and I'd seen them after. Men who hid behind paper and law and cruelty. "You think he's still coming?" I asked quietly. "I don't know," she said. Her eyes flicked up to mine, steady now. "But if he is, I'll be ready this time." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, thin, fever-worn, barefoot when she'd staggered to my door, and I thought about the burns on her wrists, the scars across her shoulders. She was already ready. Ready because she'd had to be. Ready because she'd been forced into it. My stomach turned. I went to the barn without another word, pulled the old box down from the rafters, and carried it to her. When I set it at her feet, the dust rose in a cloud between us. I opened it, showing her what lay inside. My wife's old Derringer, a Navy Colt that had seen me through Gettysburg, a handful of cartridges. I lifted the Derringer, the smallest of the lot, and held it out to her. "You shoot?" I asked. She looked at the weapon a long moment, then shook her head. "I can learn." I gave a short nod. "We'll start tomorrow." Her fingers closed around the grip, not tentative, not fearful, just sure. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. She wasn't asking me to save her. She was telling me she'd fight, and she meant it. That night we sat by the fire, the baby, fussing at a string tied to the leg of the stool, Nadita stitching a torn sleeve with those neat, careful hands. I polished the rust off a branding iron I hadn't touched in 2 years, the metal catching the firelight like an old memory. Outside, coyotes called across the flats, and the air smelled clean after the storm. Inside, no one spoke of leaving. Not her, not me, and certainly not the baby. I kept thinking about her words, the way her voice had steadied when she said she'd be ready. It stirred something in me I hadn't felt since the war. Purpose, not the kind driven by orders or duty, but something personal, rooted deep in the marrow. She had trusted me with her truth. Now it was my burden to carry too. When I finally stretched out in the chair by the door, rifle across my lap, I looked over at her sleeping with the baby in her arms. Her face was softer in sleep, the hard edges smoothed away by exhaustion. The child's tiny breaths lifted and fell against her chest, both of them bound together in the same rhythm. I felt a tension drain from me I hadn't known I carried. For the first time in years, the silence in that cabin didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a vow. I knew men in town would call it foolish if they knew. They'd use words like harboring and danger. The law would weigh it down with paper and ink, but none of that mattered to me anymore. What mattered was clear as the firelight on her face. She had run far and hard to keep that baby alive, and I had opened my door to them. That choice was mine, and I'd make it again. Before the fire died low, I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and said it under my breath, maybe to the baby, maybe to myself. You're safe now, both of you. As long as I've got breath in me, you're safe. The words weren't grand. They weren't even meant to be heard, but I felt them settle inside me like a stone dropped into still water, heavy, unshakable, and from that night on, I carried them with me. The days after I put that pistol in Anita's hand carried a different weight. Something had shifted between us. It wasn't just survival anymore, not just two souls pressed together by circumstance. There was a rhythm forming, quiet but steady, like the slow beat of a drum you don't notice until it fills the room. She moved through the cabin like it belonged to her as much as it ever did to me, and I found myself watching her in ways I hadn't let myself watch anyone in years. Each morning, I rose before first light, but now, the first sound I heard wasn't just the wind against the boards, it was her voice, low, almost a whisper, singing words I couldn't understand to calm the baby before the day began. I'd lie there for a moment in the chair by the door, letting the sound wash through me before I stood. It wasn't a love song, not in the way folks in town might sing, but it had more weight than any tune I'd ever heard. It was the sound of someone remembering who they were. The baby, Ruthie, though I hadn't said it out loud, was stronger now. She lifted her head longer, reached with small hands that curled around my finger, like she didn't plan to let go. She'd smile at odd moments, mostly when Nadita hummed or when I muttered under my breath about a stubborn fence post. Those small things stitched themselves into me, a thread I didn't realize I needed until it was already binding me tight. Nadita and I shared the work without planning it. She'd sweep the corners while I split wood. She'd set cornmeal boiling while I patched a gate. Sometimes we said nothing at all, just moved in step like two people who already knew what the other would do. Other times, she asked small questions that startled me. "Why do you keep the lantern lit at dusk?" she asked one evening while stringing beans into a pan. I shrugged. "So the road don't look so empty." She didn't smile, but I saw something soften in her eyes before she looked back at her work. It was small touches that began to undo me. The way she folded my shirts after washing, sleeves lined neat, like she respected the work they'd once done. The way she brushed past me in the narrow cabin, her hand grazing my arm for just a second longer than it needed to. The way her eyes found mine across the table some nights when the baby was finally quiet and neither of us looked away. Those moments didn't demand anything, they just were, and that was enough to keep me steady. I caught myself one afternoon carving a toy horse out of pine. My hands worked the blade without my permission, shaping ears, smoothing edges, until it sat on the table. I hadn't carved for anyone since before the war, but when Ruthie reached for it with both hands, I felt something loosen in my chest. Nadita saw it too. She didn't speak, but her fingers brushed the horse later like she was touching more than wood. The first time I laughed, really laughed, it startled us both. Ruthie had managed to fall asleep, curled inside my old hat, while Nadita strung herbs by the window. I walked in, saw her tiny body swallowed up in the brim, and the sound just came out of me, rough and strange, but real. Nadita turned, eyes wide at first, then calm. She didn't tease, didn't remark, she just let me have it. That, more than anything, told me she understood the weight laughter carried for a man who hadn't used it in years. Evenings were the hardest and the best. We sat by the fire, her stitching, me polishing tools I didn't much use anymore. The baby would fuss until Nadita settled her with a hum, and I'd watch the two of them, something in me caught between grief and wonder. I thought of the graves behind the cabin, the lives cut short, and yet here was life stirring again right under my roof. I didn't know if it was mercy or cruelty that it had come to me this way, but I knew I wouldn't trade it. One night, she asked me without warning, "Why didn't you remarry?" The question hung heavy, not cruel, just raw. I set the knife I'd been sharpening on the table and took a slow breath. "Didn't feel like something a man does twice," I said. Her eyes lowered, and she nodded. She didn't press, but later, when she handed me a tin cup of water, her fingers lingered on mine longer than before. That touch said more than words. I realized then that what was growing between us wasn't sudden or fragile. It was slow, steady, built out of quiet hours and shared burdens. It wasn't promises or declarations. It was the way her hand brushed mine when we passed tools, the way she sat close enough for our shoulders to touch without thinking twice, the way she trusted me to keep the fire lit while she slept with her child against her chest. The war had taught me that trust is rare, more costly than any weapon. And yet, here it was, given in small pieces until I found I was holding more of it than I knew what to do with. It scared me, if I'm honest. Scared me because I wanted it. Scared me because losing it would break me worse than shrapnel ever had. But as I sat one evening, the baby asleep, Nadita's hum drifting through the cabin, I realized I wasn't thinking about loss anymore. I was thinking about tomorrow and the day after, about what it meant to share a life, even if neither of us had said it out loud. And for the first time since I laid 2 loved ones into the ground, I let myself believe in something more than survival. I let myself believe in staying. I'd grown used to the rhythm we'd built, the quiet mornings, the evenings by the fire, the baby's small noises filling the spaces that used to feel hollow. For a little while, it almost felt like the world beyond the ridge had forgotten us. But trouble has a way of sniffing out peace, like a wolf catching the scent of blood. I saw the first sign when I rode into town for supplies. I'd avoided it as long as I could, but the flour was near gone, and the lamp oil had burned low. I saddled the mare, left Nadita and Ruthie at the cabin, and made the trip slow, keeping my head down the way a man learns to when he doesn't want questions. I bought what we needed, flour, salt, dried apples, cartridges, and left as quick as I came. Took the back road out, the one less traveled, thinking I'd slip home without drawing a single curious look. But halfway along the ridge, the ground told me a story I didn't want to read. Boot prints, fresh, heavy tread, pointed east toward my land. Too clean for a rancher, too direct for a wanderer. One man, maybe more. My stomach knotted tight. I reined in and studied them long, the mare stamping restless beneath me as if she felt what I did. Whoever it was hadn't come for the weather. They were looking. I didn't rush home. Rushing draws eyes. But the whole ride back, I kept my hand near the Winchester, scanning tree lines, ears straining for the sound of hooves behind me. When I finally reached the cabin, I found Nadita out back with Ruthie strapped to her chest, humming soft as she pinned laundry on the line. I called her name low. She turned, saw my face, and the hum died on her lips. "We might have company soon," I told her. She didn't flinch, didn't ask who, just straightened her back and met my eyes. "Prince?" "On the East Trail," I said. "Could be nothing, could be him." Her jaw tightened. She nodded once. "Then we stay ready." No panic, no tears, just calm resolve. I felt something in me steady at that. I'd seen men in uniform crumble at less. But she had walked 15 miles barefoot with fever burning her and still carried her child safe. Readiness was carved into her bones. That evening, we worked without saying much. She packed a small satchel for Ruthie, just in case, tucking in cloth and dried meat with careful hands. I reinforced the barn door, hammered planks across the inside shutters. She practiced loading the Derringer, fingers smoother now, no hesitation as the cartridges slipped into place. The sound of the hammer clicking back echoed in the cabin like a promise. That night, after the baby had finally settled, Nadita stood by the hearth with the pistol at her side. Her face was calm, but her eyes searched mine. "If he comes," she said, "we don't run." I nodded. "We fight." She studied me a long moment, then spoke quieter. "I need to know something." I set down the rifle I'd been cleaning. "What's that?" "You're not keeping us out of guilt?" Her voice barely lifted above the fire's crackle. "We're not a burden you just accepted?" I stepped closer, the weight of her words pressing into me harder than any blow. I wanted her to see the truth plain. "You're not here because of guilt," I said, steady. "You and that girl. I want you here. Both of you. I don't know how to say it better than that." Her lips parted, and for the first time, I saw the tension in her jaw ease. She stepped forward, pressed her hand against my chest, right over my heart. "I'm not leaving again," she whispered. I leaned down, kissed her forehead, and pulled her close. No more words were needed. The next 2 days carried an edge I couldn't ignore. I checked the fence lines 3 times a day, every sense sharpened, ears tuned for hoofbeats on the ridge. She kept Ruthie close, humming less than before, her eyes often fixed on the horizon. We spoke little of it, but every small change in our rhythm told the truth. We were bracing, waiting. One evening, as the sun bled low over the hills, we sat on the porch together. Ruthie was nestled in her sling, making soft noises against Nadita's chest. I leaned back in my chair, boots on the rail, rifle propped against the wall. The wind had stilled, and for a moment it almost felt normal again. I looked over at Nadita, her eyes half closed, rocking slow, and thought about how far she had come since the night she stumbled through my door. Her bruises had faded, the fire in her eyes returned. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it was whole. I realized then that the fear of the man who hunted her wasn't the only thing binding us. Something stronger had taken root in those quiet days. It was in the way she moved about the cabin without hesitation, in the way Ruthie reached for me now with open hands, in the way Nadita's gaze lingered when she thought I wasn't looking. The prints on the ridge told me the past was drawing near, but for the first time in years, I wasn't facing it alone. I had something worth defending, someone worth standing beside me. The thought of him finding us made my chest tighten, but it didn't hollow me out the way it once might have. If he came, we'd meet him together. That night, before the fire burned low, Nadita looked at me, her hand brushing mine where it rested on the table. "He always comes," she said. I met her eyes, steady. "Then let him. He won't walk away this time." She didn't speak again, but her hand stayed on mine, and in that silence I knew the truth. The waiting might end with blood, but it would not end with us running. I knew he'd come at dawn. Men like him always did, counting on the light to give them the upper hand, believing the morning belonged to them. I was awake before the first pale streaks reached over the ridge, rifle across my lap, boots planted steady on the floorboards. The fire had burned down to coals, the cabin dim but warm, Nadita sleeping with Ruthie curled tight against her chest. I watched them for a long while, the rise and fall of their breathing, the way her arm cradled the baby even in sleep. That sight alone was enough to steel me. Whatever was coming, I wasn't facing it for myself. I was facing it for them. The knock came like I knew it would. Hard, deliberate, not the hesitant rap of a traveler seeking shelter. A man's knock, one that announced itself like it owned the ground it stood on. My hand tightened on the rifle. Nadita's eyes opened, wide and sharp, no trace of sleep left in them. She already had the derringer in her hand, hidden beneath the folds of her shawl, the baby pressed close against her chest. She didn't say, "Be careful," or "Don't go." She just gave one short nod, and that was enough. I rose slow, careful not to startle Ruthie, and slid the latch free. When I pulled the door open, there he was, tall, rangy, clothes dusty from the trail, spurs clinking with each step as he walked forward. His left hand rested on his belt, his right loose by his side. A man who wanted me to see, he was ready without showing the weight of it outright. His face carried that same smug confidence I'd seen on officers and bullies alike, the kind that comes from believing no one will ever say no to you. "Evening, Burke Halter," he said, his voice slow, stretched out like a rope. "Heard you been keeping something of mine." I stepped onto the porch, rifle aimed but not raised. My jaw tightened. "Don't see your name on anything here." He smiled, thin and cruel. "Ain't come to argue, just here to collect what's mine and ride out quiet." I felt Nadita behind me, still in the doorway, and I knew his eyes would find her soon enough. My voice stayed steady. "She ain't yours." That smile shifted, darkened. She was, had papers, claimed her fare. I let the words hang there, the lie as bitter as bile on the air. "She's not property," I said, my voice low, hard enough to cut. Inside, Ruthie whimpered, and Nadita hushed her, the soft sound carrying through the open door. The man's eyes flicked past me, landed on them, and his face changed. He stepped forward, pointing with a hand that shook just enough to give him away. "You come now," he barked. "Don't make me come in there." My rifle lifted, steady as a heartbeat. "You ain't going anywhere near them." He stopped, boots sinking into the damp earth, his lip curled. "You willing to die for some squaw and a half-breed?" I didn't blink. I already decided. For a moment, the world went still. The wind dropped, the land holding its breath. Then his hand twitched toward his hip. That was enough. The shot cracked sharp, echoing across the flat. His body jerked, stumbled backward, and hit the dirt hard. Blood spread across his chest, dark and certain. Inside, Ruthie's cry rose high and frightened. My breath shook, but my hands didn't. I stepped off the porch, rifle steady, eyes fixed on him. He gurgled once, clawing at the dirt, then went still. It was over in seconds, though it felt stretched long, like the world had slowed to watch. I stood there a moment longer, the rifle heavy in my grip, before I turned back toward the cabin. When I walked inside, I set it down gentle against the wall and closed the door behind me. Nadita was rocking Ruthie, her face pale but her jaw set firm. She looked at me, searching for words, but none came. "He's gone," I said simply. She nodded, pulling the baby tighter. Silence hung heavy between us, not fear, not relief, just the weight of something final. The waiting was over. I buried him before breakfast, down past the fence line where the land dipped low and no eyes would ever find him by accident. I didn't ask Nadita to help. She stayed inside with Ruthie, her voice soft through the open window, singing low while I worked. My shovel struck the wet earth, each thud ringing in my bones. Sweat stung my eyes, dirt clung to my hands, and with every shovelful, I felt years of rage, grief, and loneliness burning away like dry brush in a fire. When the hole was deep enough, I dragged his body in, covered it with soil, and marked the spot with a plain stone. No name, no memory, just an end. When I came back in, she was waiting, her face calm, her eyes holding something I hadn't seen before. Not fear, not doubt, but trust. She set the baby down in her basket and stepped toward me. "Thank you," she whispered. I shook my head. No need. But the truth was, I needed to hear it more than I realized. The rest of the day passed slow, not because we were hiding anymore, but because the weight of months, maybe years, had lifted, and what was left was tiredness. The fear that had lived in the corners of our days was gone. All that remained was us, the cabin, the fire, the small child who reached for us both with steady hands. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch rail, staring out at the ridge. The air smelled clean, sharper, somehow, as if the land itself knew something had been settled. Nadita stepped out beside me, Ruthie cradled against her, and for the first time, there was no glance over her shoulder, no flinch at every sound. She just stood there, her hand brushing mine, and I knew we weren't running anymore. The night has grown quiet around me, and I sit by the fading fire with only the sound of crickets and the soft creak of the porch boards beneath my boots. It feels strange to speak of endings when what I've found is more of a beginning, but maybe that's the way of life out here. We think we're closing one door, and all the while, another one has been waiting to open. When I first stumbled into this stretch of land, I never imagined it would be a place where healing could take root. I thought I was too scarred, too worn down by loss to ever belong anywhere again. Yet here I am, with her close beside me, and for the first time in a long while, I know what it means to stay. I remember the first night like a brand burned into memory. She was standing there in the half-light, wary and thin, holding herself like she had no claim on the air around her. I saw too much of myself in her silence, that same ache of being unwanted, the weight of being cast off by people who should have cared. Maybe that's why I didn't turn her away. I told myself it was simple mercy, but deep down, I think I was already hoping she might stay. I watched her move about the cabin in those early days, quiet as snowfall, afraid to take up space. And every time she picked up a tool or mended something with careful hands, or even just breathed easier for a moment, I felt something in me shift. She taught me without knowing it, taught me that scars don't ruin a life unless we let them, taught me that trust is built not in grand gestures, but in the quiet rhythm of days shared side by side. There were times she'd look at me with eyes that held both fear and fire, and I'd feel my chest ache with the urge to tell her she was safe now, that she didn't have to fight alone anymore. But words never came easy for me, so I let my actions speak. A repaired door latch, a pot kept warm on the stove, a steady hand when hers faltered. That was the language I knew, and somehow she understood it. There was a day when the past came clawing back, when the shadows she thought she'd outrun stood again at the door. I remember standing with her, the weight of the rifle heavy in my hands, her breath quick at my side. She did not cower. She did not run. She stood. And I swear to God, I'd never seen anything so fierce and so fragile all at once. In that moment, I knew I'd give whatever was left of my life to keep her safe. Not because she was weak, she wasn't, but because she was worth it. Worth every fight, worth every scar, worth the long silence I'd lived before she walked into my world. The seasons turned, and little by little, the house stopped feeling like a hollow grave. Laughter came back, soft at first, like it didn't know if it had a place here. The air grew lighter, the rooms warmer. She began to hum sometimes while she worked, and each note carried more healing than all the years I spent chasing solace on my own. I started to believe again, not in miracles, but in simple, everyday grace, in the way bread rises when tended with patience, in the way two broken souls can piece together something steady just by refusing to let go. Now, sitting here at the edge of another season, I see what I couldn't before. Life isn't about burying the past so deep it can't be found. It's about carrying it, yes, but not letting it dictate where we plant our feet. It's about saying, this hurt me, but it didn't end me. It's about choosing every day to stay when running feels easier. I thought I'd been cursed with solitude, but the truth is, I just hadn't met someone brave enough to share it with me. I don't know what the years ahead will bring. Out here, storms can take a roof in an hour, sickness can sweep through without warning, men can show up with cruelty in their eyes. But I've learned that when two people choose each other without condition, there's no force strong enough to tear that apart. We'll face whatever comes side by side. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for. So if you've walked through your own dark season, if you've wondered whether there's anything left for you but empty nights and aching silence, hear this. It isn't over. There is more for you, more than your wounds would have you believe. Sometimes all it takes is one soul willing to see you as you are and stay. I found mine when I least expected it, and I learned that home isn't a place. It's a choice we make, again and again, to love and be loved despite the scars. Thank you for walking this road with me, for listening to my story. If it touched you, if it made you think of your own journey, I ask you to show your kindness. Like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment with your own story and follow this channel so these truths keep finding their way into the world. Every story matters, yours, mine, and the ones we've yet to tell. Out here in the Wild West, where life is harsh and love is rare, I've learned that the greatest victories are not won with guns or grit, but with the quiet, steadfast choice to stay. That's the lesson I'll carry for the rest of my days, and I hope, in some way, it stays with you too.